So I'm going to show you how to use Maya for the first time. We're going to make our first rendering. I'll go slowly and methodically and point out each step. In the bottom right, you always find an indication of what I'm doing right now. Okay, so when you first open Maya, you get this common layout with a bunch of buttons. Let's focus on the central area, which is called the viewport. If you used Photoshop or Illustrator before, this will feel really different. We're in 3D now. That means we have to think spatially. The first thing is how to navigate. If you hold down Alternate or Option on Mac and the left mouse button, you can rotate or orient the view, which is called tumbling. If you hold down Option and the middle mouse button, you can pan or track the view. And if you hold down Alternate or Option and the right mouse button, you can zoom in and out. So by using these quickly together, holding down Option and middle to pan, holding down Option right to zoom, and left to tumble, you can navigate around the view in 3D. So let's start by creating a sphere. We can open the Polygon Modeling tab. So we have a series of tabs here. We're going to choose this one called Polygonal Modeling. And then we're going to click on the sphere icon on the very left. And we should get a sphere in the center. Now, as before, we can zoom in on this by using the Alt key or Option on Mac and the right mouse button to zoom, and then orbit and pan around it. The next thing to do is to modify this object, and some very common modifications are translation and rotation. So these tools are actually shown on the left side, and you can get to them just by clicking on them. So by selecting the object, I use the Select tool, I can just click on the object. If I click elsewhere, I deselect, and if I click on the object, then I'm selecting it. It should be green. If you see something which is blue like this, then it's not in the right selection mode. So this can happen sometimes. What you need to do if you see it blue and you want to select the whole object is instead you right click. This is called a modal dialog. You right click and go to object mode, and object mode will make it green again, and so that you're selecting the entire object and not a portion of it. So again, if you have any issues, you right click with selection, you right click and make sure that you're in object mode here. Okay, so now we're going to modify the object by moving it or translating it. So the simplest tool is translate. That's this one here, which is also the W key on the keyboard. And we have these 3D GUI interfaces that have arrows that indicate the directions we can move. So if we drag on one of these directions, it will move it along that axis. And so we can move things in 3 dimensions by just changing which axis we choose to move along. If we want, we can also move something in a plane by dragging on these plane icons. So again, if we want to move something simply, we just move it along the axes, and that's how I would suggest that you get started, is just using the simple move. Okay. The next tool is rotation. If we click on the next one down, which is the E key, we get a set of gimbals that are associated with our object, and those allow us to rotate the object. So by clicking on one of these and dragging, we can see there's this angular change, and I can rotate an object. And I can combine these and do them in any order I want in order to rotate it. If I use these specific curves, it will do it along a specific axis. And if I choose anywhere, then I can just do arbitrary gimbaled rotation. Okay, so that's the move tool and the rotate tool. And the last one is the scan tool. The scale tool. And the last one is the scale tool. So I click here, and keep in mind that I can still hold down alternate and tumble my view, and I can move around the view. If I hold down alternate and middle, I can pan. So I can get different perspectives on my object. And now if I want to scale the thing uniformly in all directions, then I grab the icon in the center, the yellow icon, and that will scale uniformly. If I want to scale along one axis, then I just choose the axis I want to scale, and it will scale non-uniformly. And that's scaling. So I'm going to back up a few steps. You can always back up by doing Control-Z. I'm just going to back up a few steps to get my sphere back to something more standard. And zoom out a bit. So those tools, I just want to mention that those tools, they have shortcut keys, which are Q, W, E, R. That is selection, translation, rotation, and scaling. Those might seem arbitrary, but they're not. So Q, W, E, R are the first 4 keys on the keyboard in the top left row, which means that you can do translation, scaling, and rotation very quickly using just your 4 left fingers. This allows you to navigate with the right hand and use your left 4 fingers to do translation, scaling, and rotation. Okay, so let's move on to the next step, which is that we're going to do some lighting. So I'm going to create a ground plane so we can see some shadows. I'm going to do that by going to polygonal modeling. And if I choose this icon here, which looks like a rotated square, this is the plane tool, creates a polygonal plane. And I'm going to do that in order to create a ground plane. Now, when you click it, you won't see anything. And that's because it's currently hidden inside the sphere. So all you need to do, select your sphere, use the Move tool, and move the sphere out of the way, and you'll see the ground plane. I'm going to click on the ground plane, and I'm going to use the Scale tool to scale it up and make it much bigger so that it actually looks like a ground plane. So I've scaled up the ground plane. Now I can select the sphere again, and using the Translation tool, a Move tool, bring it back to the center, and maybe move it up a little bit so it looks like it's resting on the plane. So I have something that we can start lighting with. To start lighting, I'm going to go to the Rendering tab. So I'm using a different tab now. I'm going to Rendering, and I'm going to click on the third button in, which is a point light source. You should try experimenting with this one first. So I'm going to click on that. It will start by selecting it. So as long as I have the Translate tool on, I can just move this right out from under the sphere. If you don't see it, you may need to move objects out of the way again. So now I have this light source, and I can move that light source in 3D. So far it doesn't affect the view, but that would be really nice. So there's a very easy way to do this. What we do is we go to Lighting, and we turn on Use All Lights. And now our scene will be illuminated by the lights, the light sources in the scene. This is a very useful feature to see what a scene looks like before you do a final rendering. So as I move the light source around, we can see that it changes the appearance of the scene. If I also turn on shadows, it will look even more realistic. So I go under Lighting, this Lighting tab here, and I go down to Shadows. And now as I move the light source around, we get a fairly realistic looking scene. Okay, looks good so far. If we look at real-world objects, we notice that they have different effects. So we have some shadows here. We can see shadows in real objects. We can see that there's this lighting that curves around the surface of objects, that curves around the object. That's called diffuse lighting. That diffuse lighting gives us the sense of roundness of a shape. We also see some other things as well. We see different colors and textures, and we also see these highlights. Those highlights are called specular highlights, and they're actually a reflection of the light source. So we're seeing an image of the light source reflected in the object. We're going to try and add that next, and we do that by changing the material a little bit. So to change materials, we're going to open a new panel. This is under Windows, Rendering Editors, Hypershade. This Hypershade is a material editor. It lets us modify the appearance of objects. It may start out quite large. I find that there are a few things I like to do to get started. First, it's easier to just to close the material viewer. We won't use it that much. So I'm going to close this part of it. We want to keep this. This is called a property editor. This lets us modify the material. I also like to have the create options a little more easily accessible, so I'm actually going to move them to the top right. Okay, so I'm going to reduce the hypershade just so it takes up kind of a minimal space and I can still see my scene in the background. And I would suggest that you kind of take the same approach. You can have the hypershade window just floating around and allow you to modify materials while you select them in the background. So this object has certain properties, but it's using what's called a Lambert object, a Lambert shading, and that only gives us diffuse. It doesn't give us those specular highlights. So what we're going to do is we're going to say graph, clear graph, to make sure we're starting clear. And then we're going to go under surface in create, and we're going to create a Phong object. A Phong shading gives us those specular highlights. So I click on that. Now it hasn't changed the object yet, and there's one more thing we need to do. We need to apply this material to the object. So what we'll do is we'll select the object in 3D. We have it green, means it's selected. And now, without clicking here, so if we click, it will deselect again. So we have to make sure that we do not click, but we click on the Phong object with the right mouse button, hold it down, and do assign material to selection. That will assign this Phong object to the object. So just remember, if you click here with the left button, it will deselect, and you don't want that. You want to select the object, right-click, and then do assign material to selection. And now that material appears here. And now once it's assigned, you can click anywhere to see the full rendering. Now we have these other parameters that will let us change the appearance of the object. We have a whole section here on specular shading that will give us more control over changing the reflectivity or changing the sharpness of that point by changing this cosine. We can change the color of the highlight, and we can also change the basic color of the object just by clicking on color and selecting what the object color that we would like. So I'm going to make this orange, slightly reddish color. Okay, and if we increase the specular color and maybe make it more whiter, it might start to look a little bit like the tomatoes that we have in this example. Maybe it needs to be a little bit sharper. Okay. Once we've done some edits like this, we can always minimize the hypershade again, and then navigate around our object and look at our scene again. So we can continue to navigate using the techniques we learned earlier, holding down alternate or option, and then tumbling or navigating. And we have control over a light source. We can select the light source, and we can, using the move tool, we can move the light source around. So we get a pretty good view of our object. So to make this a bit more realistic, I'm going to add another light source. If we were doing some polygonal modeling, we might be in another panel. We're going to make sure that we have rendering selected. And again, we're going to do this third button in, which is point light source. We'll get another one, and again, it starts out in the center, maybe hidden by the sphere. We need to translate it to have it visible. And because we're using all lights, we will see that we get an image that combines both lights, which looks a bit more realistic than we had. That's starting to look like a little bit more realistic now. This display here is called a viewport rendering, and it's essentially a low quality rendering of the scene. It looks quite good, but it still has all of the GUI elements and markings. What we'd like to do next is to make a high quality rendering, and that is do a final render. It's to make a clear rendering where we try to get the highest quality possible. So we're going to do an actual rendering, and there are a couple steps that we need to do that. The rendering tools are these icons on the top right. They look like So in order to do our final rendering, we're going to use these icons here. It's an interesting side to think about why these icons look like this. In the traditional days of filmmaking, prior to the digital era, they recorded film by using actual film footage and a separate recording device. And they had the problem of how to synchronize those two things. That synchronization was done using a clapper. This is a photo of Alfred Hitchcock with a clapper for Psycho. The clapper board essentially provides a marking point where you know that some visual thing and audio is happening at the same time, and you can use those to synchronize the film footage with the audio source. This is done prior to calling action, so you would use the clapper, clap to mark the beginning of the scene, then the director would call action and the action would proceed, and you could use that as synchronization. So that's where this icon comes from, and this is the icons that we're going to use here. So the fourth one in is the one that we start with. This is the rendering settings. We're going to click on that. We may have Arnold render here when we first come in. I want to change that and change render using Maya software. I'm going to click on Maya software. And then I'm going to go into the Maya software tab and make sure that under ray tracing that I first have the quality set to highest. And I might want to increase this, say, to intermediate or production quality. And under ray tracing options, I'm going to make sure that ray tracing is turned on. Ray tracing scatters light around, and it asks the rendering to add additional light rays to scatter light around to make a more realistic picture. We'll talk more about this later. But for now, we want to add that because it will add in shadows and increase the realism of the scene. So with that, we can close this and now do a render. And we do that by clicking on the second icon over, which is render the current frame. So I'm going to click on that, and we should get an image of our scene with a nice rendering with some new effects, reflections in the object, and also these the shadows and our specular highlights and diffuse reflection. We can reduce the size of this and then do any additional navigation we want. We can look at this from another view, and if we then click on the render icon again, we'll get a new rendering from that direction. To make this more fun, I've created a scene in the real world using these plastic spheres and set up a model in the real world to give us an idea of the ground truth reality. So this is a photograph. It's not a rendering. It's a photograph of a real world scene where I've set up these objects and I am making a picture of that I'm going to try and render. Because this is a real scene, we know this is how it should look. We have a lot of more complicated effects here because this is the real world. We have multiple light sources. We have lights from windows. We have lights from overhead track lighting. And we have soft shadows because light sources are not points. So there's a lot of interesting, cool effects going here. I'm going to just see how far we can get with this. So I'm going to use this as a reference to start the next stage. The first thing I want to do is try and match my camera a little bit, just so I have some idea of what this should look like. So I'm going to rotate the view and try and set up this scene so that it looks a little bit somewhat similar. I'm going to change the scaling of the ground plane just so that it matches my test scene a little bit more. And I already have a red sphere, so I think I'll use that one in the foreground, similar. I just need to translate that. Whoop, make sure I have the right object selected. I'm going to move this around. Now this light source is up into the back, so I'm going to move the light source so that it matches the scene a bit more. This one right in the center looks like a good candidate, so move this back in the back. It's actually quite high up, so I might need to zoom out in order to place this. And you can tell from the shadows where to place things to get to kind of match an existing model. Yeah, it's starting to look pretty close, and I'm looking at the shadows here as a reference. That point light source is casting most of the shadows here. We do have some other light from the side, but because it's a window, it's a much more diffuse light and we don't have a sharp shadow. So to do that, I'm going to not use this light, a point light source. This point light source is actually causing too much of a shadow here. I'll delete that point light source. Instead, I'm going to use what's called an area light. An area light gives me a much more broader light source that does not cast such sharp shadows. An area light has an orientation, so I need to rotate the area light so that it matches my scene. It has an outward direction. You can see as I rotate the light, it has this outward direction. And I move the light source over to about where the window would be. So that's about where the window is, right next to the table. And I'm going to scale it up so that it essentially matches the size of the window. A couple other things I'm going to do with this is it's not so bright. It's not as bright, so I'm going to change the intensity here, and I can change that here. I'm going to make that not as bright. And also going to turn off shadows for it because it doesn't actually have shadows. So I'm going to come down to shadow attributes and turn off ray tracing shadows because it doesn't really cast very strong shadows. It's starting a little bit more realistic. We can see if we look closely at the sphere, we actually have these two distinct specular highlights, somewhat similar to what we have in the real world. So that's a good start for our first object, and let's just see how this render looks by clicking on the render button. Starting to get there, and a few things we need to do. So let's go back to the object. And without having to open the Hypershade, you remember that we had the Hypershade for modding material, but because we've already assigned it to this object, I can just click here and change the Phong materials directly without opening the Hypershade. What I want to do here are a few things. First, these spheres, they're made of plastic, but it's not a super mirror plastic. It's not like a very glossy plastic. It's this kind of dull plastic. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn down the reflectivity and make the reflectivity much lower. I don't want it 0 because there's still a little bit of reflection. You can see here that this is actually a reflection of this sphere and the other sphere. So I'm going to keep the reflectivity up just a little bit, but not so much that it is dominant. And if I do that, I get a somewhat better render, a little bit. I'm going to make it a little lower, actually. So in our rendering, we notice this kind of gray band, and the scene looks somewhat gray. If we look at our real-world scene, this surface is actually quite black, so that's why we shouldn't see this gray reflection. We just need to make the surface a lot darker. So we're going to create another material and assign that to the ground plane. If you remember, the way that we do that is with a Hypershade. So I'm going to go Render Editors, Hypershade. Should come up where we left it before. And I can't use the same material because if I use the same material, it's just going to be red as well. So I need to make another Phong object. And I'm going to go to Graph, Clear Graph, start a new object. I'm going to click on the Phong button to get another Phong object. Make sure this you're not using the shader glow because that's actually not the Phong object. I'm going to click on the ground plane. As if you remember before, we have to select the object. And then right-click, hold, and do Assign Material to Selection. And now I have a different material assigned to that ground plane. And I can change the color of it and make it much darker. I may need to click the Phong again just to make sure I have it selected. But once I do, I can make that a lot darker. I can also want to reduce the specular color because this is a very matte surface. It's literally a matte, so I really want to reduce the specular reflection and make it very dull, and essentially. I'm not going to worry about the grid lines for now. We can always add some texturing later, but I'm going to reduce the specular color. Not 0, because it does have a little bit of shine to it, but make it very low. And now, if we close the Hypershade and we click our render button again, should look a little bit better. What else can I do to make this more realistic? If I look at our image again, let's look closely and we notice that the light sources actually have different colors. So the light source on the left is yellower and the light source on the right is blue because it's coming from a window outdoors. So we can change that just by changing the color of the light source. I'm going to zoom out to select each light source. Select this one, and I need to move it over just a little bit, so I'm going to move it to the left a little bit. And move it back maybe and up. I can change the color of the light source just by selecting it and moving around. Notice that the whole scene is changing because you're really changing the color of the light, not just one object. Okay, and then I'll make the window color a bit bluer, the area light color, and change the color. Make that a little bit bluer, just a tad. It's still very white. It's coming from outside, but it's just a little bit of blue. That hopefully will look a little bit more like our scene with yellow on the left. I guess it needs to be quite a bit brighter actually, and blue on the right. Whiter. If it doesn't seem bright enough, you can always change the intensity and make it a little bit brighter. Let's give that a try. It's getting a bit closer. It's getting quite a bit closer. Let's put the other spheres just to give us kind of a better sense of perspective here. So to do that, we can either make new spheres or we can copy this one. But we're still going to have to make materials because they're each a different color. So we'll have to make a new Phong object for each of these. So let's go into our scene. I'm going to use the copying method. So what I can do is just select an object, hit Control-C. This will, I'm going to add the other spheres now just to give some better context. So there's a couple different ways to do this. And if you haven't done this up to this point, this next step is important. So if you have not saved your file, be sure that you save as you go along. So very easy to do. Just go to File, Save Scene, or Save As. If you're on a university computer or a library computer or something, then you want to make sure that you save to the desktop. Don't save in the Maya directory because you might not have permission to write there. So be sure that you save to your desktop or to your USB stick. And you can give it whatever name you want. Just save it as a Maya binary and then do save. If you're using a student version, it might give this message. You can just click continue. Don't worry about it. Once it's saved, you should see at the top that the file has been saved. And anytime you want to save intermediate progress, you can hit Control-S and save it. So I'm going to add the other spheres just to give us some more context and kind of move us closer to the scene that we're trying to match. The way I'm going to do this is you can either do it by going to polygonal modeling and adding another sphere, going back to the modeling panel and creating more geometry, or you can do it just by copying an object that's in the scene, and I'm going to use that method. So I'm going to click on the object. I'm going to get Control-C to copy. It's going to ask to save the file, and I'm going to get Control-V to paste, and I should get a copy. It will overlap the same one, so I need to move it over in order to actually see the object. This purple one I'm going to do next. It's a little bit more forward. There's still a little gap there. Because they're each different colors, I need to create a new material for each of them. So I'm going to create a material for purple and green. So I'm going to go to the window, render editors, Hypershade again. This is where I create materials, if you recall. I'm going to do graph, clear graph, and then go to the create panel and look for Phong again. Click on Phong. And I go through the same process. I click on the object to select the object in the scene. Right click on the material and do assign material to selection. Now I have a new object. And here I'm going to change the color to that pink color from the scene. Okay. Make sure that if it doesn't change right away, again, make sure that you've selected the object and then clicked on Phong 3. It might not happen the first time. And then you can change the color, and it should change it in the scene. Okay. So you get a better rendering. Looks a little bit more like the scene. So there's a major effect here that's missing, and that is that in the real world, there's a lot of light bouncing around. And we see that as essentially light scattering. These spheres in particular, they scatter a lot of light internally. So they have a lot of internal scattering. We're not going to do that in the really proper way of doing it as self-illuminated, because they're not really self-illuminating. They don't glow, but they essentially scatter around a lot of light. An easy way to emulate that is using what's called ambient lighting. So ambient lighting is basically adding overall light to a single object. So we do that quite simply by going to the object. We don't have to use the Hypershade. If we have the object, we can go directly to the Phong material, which is the material for that object. And I'm going to change the ambient color. And that ambient color is the color of the object as a whole without respect to the light source. It just adds overall light to an object. And so it needs to be the same color. You don't have to have it the same color. But you can see that by doing that, I get something that really looks like it glows much more. And I can change the level of that so that I can emphasize the shape of the object or emphasize its kind of glowing ability just by modifying that ambient color. I'm going to make this object a little bit redder because the scene is a little bit redder. Okay, and now we get a sphere that really looks a lot more like what we've seen in our image. I'm going to do the same thing for the purple object just by changing the ambient color, and it's also going to be purple. And that gives us a much more realistic image. This window is still a little bit large. The reflections seem a little bit too large. So I'm just going to scale down the window a bit. And it actually maybe needs to move over as well. So if we move it over, there we go. Okay. Okay, so let's try that. That's starting to get there. Now we're really starting to get something that looks quite a bit like our scene. Adding the lights, getting the lights in the right position. And you see they're still not quite right, still too much. We still have too much specular highlight. And adding the ambient light really improved the scene quality a bit. We have some reflections here in the ground, and that just doesn't make sense because this is a totally matte material. It shouldn't have any, it's not mirror-like in any way, so there shouldn't be any reflection. So we're going to turn off the reflection of the ground plane here. And that's of course done just by selecting the object, selecting the Phong material, and we just turn down the reflectivity so that the reflectivity on the ground really is totally zero. There's really no reflection happening there. And that will get rid of that reflection that we saw in the ground. Okay. I'm going to add the last few objects now, and we're almost there. So I just need a few more objects. It's done easily enough by just doing copy paste again. So copy, Control C, Control V. You have to click on this each time if you're using the student version. And just move the object around to match the scene. Yellow, blue, and green. So I'm just using my reference to position them correctly. I'm going to worry about the colors in just a minute, just trying to get a better sense of their position. I'm using the tumble and navigation tools to try and set up the scene positioning a little bit better. This needs the ground maybe needs to move to the right a little bit, it looks like, and maybe even scale up a bit. Yeah. And I still need a sphere in the back. Okay. Okay, let's try to get the colors a little bit better. That blue one needs to move to the left a little. Yep. Okay, try to get the colors a little better. As I mentioned before, I need to create a material for each. I have the 2 blue spheres, so I can, of course, reuse that material. But the others, I'm going to have to kind of create new ones for green and yellow. So come in here, graph clear, create another Phong, select the object. I think this one's green, yep. Right click, hold, assign material to selection. Make sure that I click it again in order to edit that color. And now I'm going to go to green, get the green color. And I'm also going to change the ambient color to green so I get the kind of like glowing effect. Okay. I also need a blue one and a yellow. So clear graph, click on Phong, click on the object I'm working on, right click, hold down and do add assign material to selection. I need to make sure that I select the material again, the Phong again, and now I'm going to work on yellow. And then also change the ambient color to yellow as well to get the glowing effect. And I only need one more. So graph clear, Phong, going to select that object, right click and hold down, assign material to selection, and then make sure that I click the material again in order to change it. So now I'm going to blue. And changing ambient color to blue. Okay. I have one more in the back. I can reuse the same material. So all I need to do is select the object. And with my blue material, I'm just going to right click and do assign material to selection. And now that one is reusing the same material, which means that if I change this material, they're both going to be changed because they're sharing the same material. Okay, I think that about covers it. Looks pretty good. I'm going to render and see what I come up with. So it looks pretty good. There's a few interesting things we see here. We see that we actually have the sphere reflections in other spheres. And we have our ambient color is really kind of looking correct. It looks like the window is maybe a little bit too tall, so I'll just quickly change that. We have a bit too much window reflection, so I think that window needs to be stretched down actually. Stretch the window down. Windows are not so tall. Move it down. And that should make it look a little bit more like narrower, I guess. The reflections are a little bit too strong. We can see that if we look at this reflection, the reflections are actually not so strong. So we can modify that by just reducing the reflectivity of the object. You won't see that in the viewport because the viewport can't show those reflections. But this is where we need to start looking at our final renders to make sure that we're seeing what we want. So I'm going to reduce the reflectivity of these materials just so that the reflected spheres are not so strong to get rid of this, which is, there's still, you can see it still does happen here, like this yellow. It really should be reflected, but it's not such a strong effect. So keep in mind I have multiple materials now, so I need to do that on each of the materials. So I'm going to select it. I'm going to go to the Hypershade, and I'm working on green, so I'm just going to change the reflectivity to maybe 0.1 instead of 0.5. We can see right away that that is going to diminish that a lot more. Maybe it needs to even be lower, so maybe 0.05. Just reduce the slider and render again. Yep, that looks better. So I'm going to do blue and yellow as well. Yellow, change the reflectivity to 0.05. And now in the blue, reflectivity to 0.05 instead of 0.5. And that gives us a render that looks very similar to our scene. So really kind of getting there. That's a nice place to stop for right now. So that's the first tutorial. There's only one kind of effect missing here, which is that soft shadows, and we're going to cover that in another episode. This kind of wraps up this episode of just kind of giving you an introductory render to Maya. Hope you've enjoyed it. In the next episode, we're going to talk about some keyframing and doing a little bit of animation. And we'll come back to more lighting stuff in the future. But that wraps it up. Talk to you next time.